Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Rob Caskie, proudly telling stories. And I've been asked to share my story called Resounding Resilience. And I plan in the story to take some examples from history to illustrate the matter of resilience or grit, which I hope you'll find inspiring and indeed an example as we face a somewhat uncertain future. You know, when I came back from Antarctic on the 19th of March last year, I was told that all of our work had been cancelled for the remainder of that year. Unbeknown to me, it was going to continue into this year, 2021. And I have good friends who live locally in my hometown of Howick in the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands who have a beautiful stone path in their garden. And the first flagstone that one steps onto as you step off the veranda has on it the words, "Don't complain about the darkness if you haven't lit a candle." And that really made a profound impact on me in terms of how I might or might not face this dark time ahead of us with all work cancelled, the uncertainty of lockdown and COVID, international travel banned, no travellers coming into South Africa, and so forth. And I reflect strongly upon a remarkable Norwegian explorer called Fridtjof Nansen. Fridtjof Nansen is perhaps best remembered as a neurosurgeon. He's also remembered for the remarkable Nansen passport that he created for displaced individuals at the end of the First World War. Remarkable effort for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And people forget that this magnificent Nordic outdoorsman with a fantastic physique, incredibly resourceful and strong, magnificent skier and ski jumper, also a very talented gymnast, that he was the first man to ski across the ice cap of Greenland, that largest island on earth, Greenland, that has been pushed 3 kilometers below the ocean by the weight of the ice cap. All attempts hitherto to cross the Greenland ice cap had been made from the protected, sheltered west coast towards the east coast. And Nansen, who once so famously said, "I always burn my bridges behind me, then there's no option but forward." I always burn my bridges behind me, that there's then no option but forward. He decided that the way to tackle the ice cap was to land on the deserted, inhospitable, frigid east coast of Greenland. Take off from there with companions and sleds across the ice cap because they knew heading towards shelter, sanctuary, warmth, and so forth on the west coast, confirming his remarkable adage or saying. Well, when they attempted to land on the east coast of Greenland, floating sea ice and pack ice prevented them getting off the ship with their little kayaks and sleds, less than 50 miles from shore. And as they tried to make their way through this floating sea ice and ice floes, they eventually drifted more than 120 miles, 200 kilometers south of where they wanted to begin their march and ski attempt across the ice cap. And then they had to move all the way back further north to resume their journey. It took them 30 days to land alone. And Nansen, with 4 companions, would successfully be the first to ski across the mighty ice cap of Greenland, which I think should give you some idea of his resilience and his persistence. He was then determined to try and be the first man to get to the North Pole, 90 degrees north, and he had a ship built called Fram, which in Norwegian means forward, by a remarkable Scottish shipbuilder called Colin Archer. And the Fram had a shape a bit like half a boiled egg, designed that way that if she were pinched by the ice would pop the Fram out of the ice and she could rest on the ice until the ice gave way and the ship could right itself and sail away. And Nansen decided that he wanted to jam himself into the sea ice on the Russian side of the Arctic Ocean, believing that the currents moved from east to west in the Arctic Ocean and could drift his ship, which he would use really as a floating base or floating hut over the North Pole. When he realized that that drift, in fact, came quite a long way south of the North Pole and he was never going to make it, this remarkable human being got off the ship with a companion called Helmer Johansen, who must have been as tough as they come, 2 kayaks, 2 sleds, 14 dogs. They were about 400 miles from the North Pole, and they took off in their attempt to get to the North Pole. Do you know that they made it to a position 225 miles from the North Pole? What's that, about 360 kilometers from the North Pole? Furthest north. But every time they rested, the ice cap and the sea ice was drifting south. How demoralizing must that have been? To get up in the morning, you take your readings with a sextant between the horizon and the sun and realize that you're actually south of where you stopped last evening for a rest. Eventually realizing they weren't going to make it to the North Pole, they took off south again to try and join up, not with the Fram, but to get to solid land on Franz Josef land. Well, at one point, they were dealing with a walrus that they'd shot for meat on the edge of the ice floe when the wind blew both of their kayaks off the ice floe into the water. Nansen, without hesitation, stripped off his heavy outer Arctic jacket, dived into that frigid ocean, swimming after the kayaks, knowing that if they lost them, death would surely follow. Because those kayaks, they often strapped together with the sleds across them, a bit like a catamaran, and paddled across open water, then resumed their journey on the ice with the dogs. Do you know that he managed to catch up to the one kayak, but was so weak and overcome now with cold that he really battled to pull himself into that kayak and then paddled to the second to recover it. Johansson said when he got back, he stripped. He was pretty white, his skin, but looked really quite hale and hearty. And these men, for warmth, used a 2-man reindeer skin sleeping bag. And Helmer Johansson now had to try and hold and impart some warmth back into Nansen's frozen body. Remarkable, remarkable journey. Well, as the winter approached, these men got to the northern extremity of Franz Josef land. And they were obliged to dig literally a little cavern into the ice, a subterranean cavern in the ice. They shot as many seals and walruses as they could to stash the meat for the coming winter. The fat they stashed in a cache outside of their subterranean cavern, and they put the skins in the base of that cavern to give them some insulation from the ice beneath. But as the months rolled by, that skin on their hides beneath them was beginning to rot. Try and imagine the smell. On a number of occasions, they shot polar bears. On one occasion, a polar bear tried to get into the passage that they used for entry into that subterranean cavern. They had to destroy that polar bear, which had already eaten most of the fat cached outside of their little cavern. And as they shot it, apparently all the fat was being regurgitated by this mighty bear. Well, as the winter turned to autumn, they resumed their journey south, and it wasn't long before they heard British voices. It was the Jackson expedition, a British expedition on Franz Josef land. They were rescued, and a week later they were reunited with the crew of the Fram back in Tromsø in Norway. It is a quite staggering story. And now we swing our attention really to the south, 90 degrees south. That little pole on which our great globe rotates, the South Pole. Many had tried to get there. It was Robert Falcon Scott, the Royal Naval officer, who was obsessed with man-hauling and always said, we shall stick it out to the end. It was Scott who, along with 4 companions, would eventually get to the South Pole on the 17th of January of 1912. Now, when I talk about man-hauling, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to imagine men linked together in traces. Those traces indeed linked to a sled, where you're pulling a sled in unison. So your movements have to be completely synchronistic. If you stop, the sled runners freeze onto the ice, and you've got to jerk the sled to get it moving to resume your journey. As a result, they tended not to eat or drink during the man-hauling section of the day, would eat and drink first thing in the morning, and then at the end of the distance they hoped or wished to cover in a day. The distance was measured by a sledge wheel, a bit like a bicycle wheel, that ran on a runner off the back of the sled, giving them a fairly accurate idea of how far they'd travel in a day. because Antarctic is the highest, driest, windiest continent on Earth, never mind the coldest. The South Pole is situated at 10,000 feet above sea level. If you walked on top of the Drakensberg, you'll be well aware of the shortness of breath created by any exertion at that sort of elevation. Well, Scott and his men, who were obsessed with man-hauling, said nothing can approach the height of that fine conception which is realized when a party of men go forth to face hardships, dangers and difficulties with their own unaided efforts. What a wonderful quote about resilience. Well, do you know it was Bertie Bowers, the youngest man in the party, 28 years of age, who noticed something standing where he thought the South Pole should be on the 16th of January 1912. He kept his thoughts to himself. Their worst fears were realized the following day. There at the South Pole stood a little black emergency silken Norwegian tent, a bamboo pole on which fluttered the Norwegian flag, an upturned sled, dog tracks everywhere. And Scott wrote, "Great God, this is an awful place. And to have reached it without the reward of priority. All the daydreams must go now, and we must make our way back." His footnote reads, "Can we do it?" 880 miles, 1,500 kilometers lay ahead of them back to their hut at Cape Evans on Ross Island. There are some authors who suggest that they died psychologically in the moment they realized they'd been beaten to the South Pole. The first man to die was a mighty man-mountain called Edgar Taff Evans. He'd cut his hand badly doing some carpentry on the sled, reducing the sledge runners from 12 feet to 10 feet, that they created less resistance on the ice. Cut his hand badly, it went gangrenous. I think he gave up. Eventually his face was a great suppurating mass of pus and frostbite. He fell into a small crevasse and cracked his head, probably suffered some sort of aneurysm or bleeding on the brain. He died at midnight on the 17th of February of 1912. The men struggle on. Perhaps I need to tell you a little about a remarkable man in that party called Lawrence Edgar Grace Oates. Well, Lawrence Oates, everyone called a soldier. He was an officer in Enniskilling Dragoons, and fighting in this country, South Africa, in 1900 against the Boers. He had been shot in the thigh, breaking his femur. The leg healed well enough, but left him with a left leg that was slightly shorter than the right leg. In my opinion, a strange choice for a polar party where the physical demands on a human being could not be more extreme. And perhaps I need to remind you of a conversation that Oates had once had with his photographer called Herbert Ponting, where Ponting posed the question of what a man should do if his condition on a sledging journey imperiled his comrades. And Oates said, suicide. You've got to have access to the firearm or access to the opium and the morphine in the medicine box to take your own life. His comrades wouldn't allow him to take his own life. That wound in the thigh turned gangrenous. Both feet turned black with frostbite. He prayed to be left alone on the ice in his sleeping bag. His comrades refused. He's stumbling alongside of the sled. His three companions, Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bertie Bowers, pulling the sled. On the 16th of March of 1912, he went to bed praying he wouldn't wake. He'd cut his reindeer skin sleeping bag open from end to end, that it'd be easier to get into, but in that condition will not keep you warm. He refused to remove his boots because of the pain involved in putting them back on. And would you believe, on the 17th of March of 1912, he got up in that dark green tent, a blizzard howling outside, and said to his comrades, I'm just going outside and I may be some time. They knew that as a gallant gentleman, Titus Oates, the soldier, was walking to his death to give them a chance for life. Do you know that his body's never been found? And it was his 32nd birthday. With the most remarkable resilience, Scott, Wilson and Bowers continue for 4 more days to the 21st of March of 1912, where they were only 11 miles from One Ton Depot, 11 miles from a depot that should have been positioned 150 miles out from the hut, but because of the season and the difficulties with sledging, were placed 2 degrees, 120 miles out from the hut. They were 11 miles from One Ton Depot. When all 3 of them succumbed towards the edge of March of 1912, the remarkable Norwegian who'd beaten them to the pole, Roald Amundsen, was apparently sitting in a bath when he heard the news of what had happened with Scott's party. And he sat up in the bath and said ruefully, "Scott wins regardless," knowing that Scott would be a greater hero dead, having come second in the race to the pole, than he ever would have been had he survived, having lost the race to the pole. Amundsen, perhaps one of the most remarkable of them all, the first man through the Northwest Passage, that mighty passage that links the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, the first man to get to the South Pole, the first man over the North Pole, flying over it in a great dirigible, a hot air balloon, in 1925. A man who during the Northwest Passage had been iced in at Herschel Bay on the Canadian-Alaskan border and wanted the world to know that they'd made it through the Northwest Passage, confirmed by whaling ships that were in the same position, having come there from San Francisco. And he skied. He skied 500 miles inland to Eagle City, Alaska, to the nearest telegram station, to send a telegram out to the King of Norway and to his sponsors that the Norwegians were first through the Northwest Passage. The rather unscrupulous man in charge of that telegraph station was aware of the news that he was sending out to his king and his sponsors, and he slipped the news to the American press, and Amundsen, as a result, never trusted the press thereafter when they let him down so badly at Eagle City in Alaska in 1905, 1906, during that incredible attempt in a little ship called the Joa to get through the Northwest Passage.